Well, listen, welcome everyone. Good to see all of you back here. Those of you who are listening to this on the Light On, Light Through audio podcast, you're not going to see us, you're going to hear us. But those of you who are watching this on video will see my conversation with Jaqueline McLeod Rogers, who is a professor at the University of Winnipeg. She's written a whole bunch of books, edited a whole bunch of books as well. Her most recent book is McLuhan's Technosensorium City, that was published a couple of years ago. But today we're going to talk about an even newer book entitled Crises Then As Now. Marshall McLuhan with urbanist Jaqueline Tyrwhitt and artist Gyorgy Kepes. I hope I pronounced that last name right. Is it Kepes? Jaqueline?
Yeah, they usually go with Kepes, I think is,
Kepes?
yeah.
Okay.
But Tyrwhitt
Well,
was,
I like pronouncing people's names properly.
yeah.
So obviously, your book is provocative. Anything that has a title and the first word is crises, and then even more so than as now, which suggests that we've had crises for a while, suggests some kind of provocative and very important book. So why don't we start by your telling our viewers and listeners what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, well, it's an interest to study McLuhan, as I have done for rather intensively for about 15 years now. I guess the books were answering questions I had and doing the sort of probing the sort of issues I wanted to examine, and that had to do with when he's talking about technology. How does that carry forward and have any relevance to the really specific kinds of problems we have now? That's not like, some 50 years ago, even 60 years ago. And, I might find another several characters or theorists if what he was saying was speaking to an age that was so different than ours, a television age where things were really much slower. But in so many ways, the kinds of concerns I found he raised, interestingly, were those that were being raised in other sectors, and the whole notion of working together as not necessarily a team, but the interdisciplinary urge they were following in terms of responding to crisis matters, that seemed inspiring too. So it was sort of a push-pull. I was pulled towards it by seeing that a lot of what they were saying tended to address problems that are current and just as serious. I mean, they were in some ways they were more alarming because they were just coming to light. So, they were trying to put things back together, particularly a person like Turret, who came from Europe and directly from the blazes of World War II. Like for her, reconstruction and trying to think how you would make global alliances and have media connecting people in ways that would work. I mean, we tend to take this for granted now, but they were trying to sort of chart that territory and see better ways or good ways to do that. And yeah, so that was the push. And uh, or I'm not sure. I'm trying to use a push and a pull. I'll try to get it sorted out. The other thing that has driven me towards that kind of an approach. Do these people do these um, public intellectuals and practitioners who are working, before we did, what do they have to offer us now? It seems there's so many in the academy now who tend to think of those figures as kind of, I don't want to get too much of this as my hobby horse, but see these figures as giving a legacy of crisis, like not having solved it, having created it through exploitative practices, colonialism, and never saying no, just that urge to expand. And in so many ways, supporting those six systems that we're the inheritors of. But when you look at the kinds of efforts they were making, and here's where I'll bring up our Kepes and McLuhan, to make people stop, slow down, become aware. I mean, all of the things, if we had done some of the things they were asking us to do then, we would be in so much a better position now, have more understanding, have more maybe restraints on certain technologies, understand a kind of proper relationship between the technologies that will come, because they certainly weren't saying they shouldn't. But that whole effort to come up with in McLuhan's case, it was really a personal wanting people to understand what their relationship with technology might be, a more manageable way. With Kepes, he had a lot of the civics going on where he wanted people to come together and organize. So he actually, I think, shared a lot of that thinking with McLuhan and kind of lit a fire under him to see it's not just a personal, but it's a political issue at hand.
Let's talk a little bit about the structure of your book. And you mentioned Tyrwhitt and Kepes, and obviously their names are in the title of your book. And not only that, two of the chapters of your book are actually written by people who are respectively experts in Tyrwhitt and Kepes. And I am always especially interested in how authors bend the narrative structure. It becomes especially interesting in novels in which there are novels within novels, but it's also being done increasingly in nonfiction as well. So, what motivated you to do this? I mean, you sort of indicate in the book itself that these people are more expert about Tyrwhitt and Kepes than you are, but that's always the case, right? Anytime someone writes a book and they write about people, there are always other experts who are more expert about those people than the actual author. But you went the additional step of actually inviting them to write individual chapters. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that decision.
Well, and maybe it's a bit of a media ecology approach, or informed by that idea. I was really aware because I brought up Kepes and Tyrwhitt in Technosensorium City and became aware of them as figures in McLuhan's life and influential figures, I thought, and under researched influential figures in his life. But I was tending to see them, and I was very aware of that. And because of my expertise being in McLuhan and communications, I was seeing them through that one lens and how they were generative for him. Or, oh, if she thought that, that seems to have influenced McLuhan's thinking on cities and city planning. They have the same definition. I'd have to be honest and say, when I both these wonderful researchers and experts on Tyrwhitt and Kepes, excuse me, Paul. They came up with. I did, in the end, I didn't think it was a dovetail. I would have liked a neater, them saying, yes, your narrative is absolutely right. That's how we read it too. Didn't happen. So I thought I'll forge ahead. And I like those figures. I think what they were doing, what they tell us about what Kepes and Tyrwhitt were, what they wanted to do and what they did, is so interesting and so valuable, and still has the same heart of what I wanted to get at. Like the notion of what they were doing is addressing the same kind of issues and problems. They were looking for solutions. They weren't, pig-headedly and doggedly imposing solutions. Yeah, but unfortunately, it wasn't necessarily the same reading that I would have had of these figures. I think, in particular, to be honest, Shoshkas had trouble. I'm not sure she particularly likes, I wouldn't say much of McLuhan, all of McLuhan. And I think she finds Shoshkas a fairly maybe refined and really focused figure who, it really does depend, doesn't it? Later, I talked to Terry McLuhan about it, and she said, "Oh, she was actually our family friend. She spent so much time in our house, and it was me who went to her island in Greece for the last year, and she was very influential. One of the few people who were come and go characters in our lives, and was really part of the family. So, I guess that's when you look at figures from a historical lens is you can find some things still are kind of fun house and some things come clearer. So I understand that, in some ways, I'm not entirely content to say I was wrong to think they influenced McLuhan and that there was so much interaction. I think their views of these figures is so deep, they just don't really see how he plays into their narratives as much as, like, I think I was more sensitive to the interplay. I'll put it that way.
Well, I think Karl Popper, if he was alive, would be very happy with what you just said, because, of course, Popper's view is that you learn much more when someone disagrees with you and criticizes you than if someone just says, "Oh, everything you've done is wonderful." Years ago, I came across an interesting couple of pages in the journal called Science. Uh, Science is the US equivalent of Nature in the UK, or vice versa. They're both the leading sort of scientific journals, but they're not so heavily burdened with equations and charts and so on that someone who's not a scientist can't read it. Anyway, what was in these pages was really fascinating. Someone was responding to a letter to Science which had some serious disagreements with his research. And what the researcher said in this response is, there were about 15 letters which said how wonderful my research was. And then I, see this letter. And my first response, of course, was I was not happy. But now I realized I've learned much more trying to understand why this person disagreed with what I said. Maybe I could have improved my mode of communication and so on. So in writing this book, you are another example of that. We learn more from falsification than we do from confirmation.
But also one of those, be careful what you wish for. I was wishing for a bit of a corrective lens, assuming it was going to move me an inch, but it was maybe pushing me an extra couple of inches. Yeah.
Yeah, this comes up all the time, of course, and I'm sure you've had your own experiences with editors
Yeah.
that, when you send a manuscript in to an editor for some publication, what, of course, you want is to hear from the editor, "Oh my God, this is the most wonderful thing I've ever read, such good points, beautiful language, we're rushing it right out to press as soon as possible." And every single little criticism hurts. But the fact is, when you take the criticism seriously, you might not agree actually with some of them, but you almost always find that it's something that helps you develop your thoughts. Let's
Yeah.
do, go ahead.
Written a longer, a too long chapter about Susan Langer and McLuhan. And finally, the editor threw up their hands in exhaustion and said, yeah, I know you like that part. Just take, it can be your other article. Take that away and save it for another day." So, yeah, yeah.
Well, I wouldn't want to go so far as to say editors are always right. My first science fiction novel, The Silk Code, which won a couple of awards, it actually has two places in time in which the story takes place: the present day, but also in the 700s AD. And so I originally wrote it where there were a couple of chapters in the present. Then I went back to 700 AD, then a couple of more chapters in the present, then back to 700 AD. And my editor, David Hartwell at Tor Books, unfortunately, my late editor, not because he didn't come on time, but because he's no longer with us, suggested that, well, and actually insisted more than suggested, you should put all the 700 AD action in one place so people can read it because it's a very good story. And I didn't actually agree with that. I like going back from time to time, but he pretty much insisted. So I said, okay. And sure enough, one of the first reviews said, this could have been a really, excellent novel, except it's totally confusing. Out of the clear blue sky, it goes back to 700 and stays there. So I do think it's important that authors fight for what they think should be, because after all, it's your book, as an author. But on the other hand, there is that dynamic. The editor's criticisms can and often are incredibly useful. Let's get back to the crises part of your book. If you Google Marshall McLuhan nowadays, and it's been this way for a couple of years, you find all kinds of references to Marshall McLuhan worldwide. And the gist of almost all of them is, as McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. And if you look at the dreadful state of our world, and it is indeed not in very good shape, I think most rational, sane people would agree. The reason these people who cite McLuhan always say is, well, it's because of social media. Twitter, now X, what they've done is gotten in the way of rational discourse. You can't really explain anything in a soundbite. Andrey Mir, who, in my opinion, has written some really important books in the last couple of years, he has made the point that what has happened because of social media is that the quest for likes and shares has replaced the goal of presenting the truth in public communications. So, what's your view on this? Do you think the medium is the message is more important than ever to understand? And is Mir right that to some extent Trump in office, all of these things, I mean, much more dreadful in the United States. None of this is going on in Canada. So here in the US, we have ICE, which I consider the American Gestapo, rounding up people on the street, basically shoving them down to the ground, then picking them up and putting them on a plane and sending them to Ecuador or God knows where, to some horrible prison without an iota of evidence, without due process, et cetera, et cetera. Is all of that, or even most of that, the fault of the media?
Well, I think that it's as you would guess. I think there's more confluence, like there's more interactive problems. Social media is definitely social fabric and being difficult with democracy, eating away at that, eating away at public and intelligence and judgment, I suppose. But the other forms of crisis that people are recognizing have to do with decay of the natural world. Morning in the news, artificial intelligence, just the sheer amount of energy it uses to run things so that people have access to, whether we want it or not, artificial intelligence. It's kind of, I think it's the interactive nature of the things coming together with, I mean, that's my preference, because I tend to look at the material world and design, structure, infrastructure, and even nature, some of the ecological literature right now about disaster. So I agree there's this, yeah, yeah, I agree there's a falling back in terms of judgment, and I think the internet and social media has had some damaging effects. I mean, I just reviewed Eva Berger's book on that context blindness, but my worry there is, um, not to be too blasé, but it's kind of there's always something. You know what I mean? I brought up Mark Bauerlein, who used to say the dumbest generation, a very accusatory way about people watching television, I think. Or at any rate, there's always what McLuhan would call more of a moral panic, and now I am really underestimating the effects of a change in how we interact. It is a huge change, but I think it's the fact that it's together with so many other things. The fact that news goes around the world, that we see everything all at once. So that it's Postman used to go on about that, I think, and Christine Nystrom, that all the information we're being bombarded with and no way to filter or organize the amounts. So I guess social media has given us kind of a lazy way to do that. Yeah, but as to saying it's the root of all ills, it contributes, but I mean, if we go back to our, the McLuhan and Postman, their statements about everything, it can be a use or it can be a bummer. It's how, you can make it something that will really assist you moving forward, or you can use it for ill. And, as usual, I'd say we are using it for ill, and Andrey's probably right in many of those cases. When he looks at how we're not interested in what the media reports anymore, and we turn to our friends and neighbors to tell us what's up. I mean, almost what could be worse, but yeah, yeah.
Well, I agree with you completely about technologies being capable of being used for good or evil. The way I look at it is, you think about guns, knives, and pillows. We think that some people think technologies are guns. They do bad things. Some think they're pillows. A nice, comfortable place to put your head. They're actually knives. Most technologies are, even all technologies are, because they can use to cut food. Surgeons can use them to help people who have problems that need surgery. But obviously, criminals and crazy people can use them, knives, to stab people. And the truth of the matter is, a pillow, it can even be used to murder somebody. Every once in a while you see a movie where somebody suffocates
Yeah,
somebody.
someone like Mike Lindell trying to sell one. Yeah, yeah,
Exactly.
I take your point.
Yeah.
See,
Yeah, and even I mean, guns. I guess I don't know. I mean, I'm not a hunter, and I never would be. But I guess if you're someplace out in the woods starving, and all you have is a weapon, you have a better chance of living if you can shoot a deer or a rabbit or whatever. So I do think all of that does cut in both ways. Let's talk a little more about AI, though, because I did notice in your book, and you just said, for you, the main concern, and correct me if I'm wrong, is not so much social media, it's AI. And I would be interested if you could elaborate on that, what McLuhan had to say about AI. Obviously, AI was very different in McLuhan's time, but just as McLuhan was so good about understanding that someday we would have media where anyone could communicate with anyone in any part of the world instantly, i.e., the global village. McLuhan also was way, way ahead of his time in understanding automation. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the crisis of AI and why you're so concerned about it.
I'll talk a little bit about it. I do see it. I mean, it's really weird how fast things happen when you think about reading those passages in McLuhan that even 10 years ago might have struck us as oh, I guess he sort of fell asleep at the wheel when he wrote that stuff about, the future of language. Well, we won't talk anymore. It'll be ESP. All those sort of predictive that we would be losing control of how language circulates. And we once, I guess, thought that meant more the connectivity of the internet, and how that we would be sending the signals, but it would be doing it for us. But now we're sort of seeing that we won't be talking, and we won't be necessarily thinking. It's actually the whole transfer from the human to the machine. It's not comfortable. Like, we've been, it's kind of sad. It's like we've been warned, and that's another part of my research that I wish I could say it's enjoyable, but you do find what McLuhan would say, like extensions, amputations, be careful. Like, that should be warning enough some 60, 70 years ago. You come up to someone like James Bridle, um, Joichi Ito, he speaks from MIT saying, learn to make friends with them or else they'll be the masters. Why are we being whipped by these things? We should be learning to so to me, I guess I'm saying AI and social, they're all kind of related. I really don't see so much the sharp divisions, but they're incrementally more, like it takes more all the time. We have less to give, I guess, and they take more, but it seems like it's the same operation all over again. And what I wish, if there was only a commentator who could tell us something new to do, but there's nothing, that's the kind of trip point, I think. If you realize that whatever McLuhan was saying about what needed to be done, there you get Shoshana Zuboff at the end of her tome, and she tells us, stop calling friends, internet people you've never met, start making genuine connections. It's everything they would have said being said again. So the same perfume, different bottle sort of thing. Perfume is probably not the right word for it, but I mean, there's really only that advice. And it makes me wonder if that's sometimes why McLuhan tried to be funny or outlandish or get attention for how you'd say it, because it's life and death. And you try to get the attention of as many people as you possibly could. You know, but that's the kind of part that gets a little depressing to me. Not so much then there's social media, now there's AI. It's just the level of resistance, like narcissus narcosis, it's the same human response of just, okay, good night. We sort of see it. I mean, I was so shocked when you must have been shocked, Paul. Remember when all of a sudden it was just after Christmas and AI would creep onto your Google page, it's giving you the first definition. I remember the first time I saw it, I was outraged. I thought, how did that get there? At least Wikipedia, we were trying to do something collectively, whether it had its bumps and warts, at least it was a human-made document, live document. And now comes AI giving us anyway, but now nobody even blinks twice. I have to say to students, if you're getting a definition, please, just for now, we might change the rules in a year or two, but try to jump over the AI first on offer definition and see what other sources would have said. So you could have a source to attach to it. But yeah, so I guess I know I'm not really I'm just saying AI bugs me, but it bugs me because it seems like it's not so much that there's been this deep divide and now we're going into the dark. It's just like incrementally we keep doing the same thing. Like who knows what will come next? There's got to be a next. And a 10 to 1, unless we change a lot, we keep nodding and saying, okay, I don't like it, but I guess this is what we've got.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I'm not that worried about AI, in part because I'm an egotist. So I'm happy to see that when you search on my name, you get a lot more material, and things do move. Right. I mean, of course, the problem is all of it correct, and there's no doubt that some of what AI produces is just wrong. I mean, everybody has their own favorite examples of you search on something, AI just gives you wrong information. Uh, but if you consider the fact that AI is still in its infancy, the percentage of wrong information is really pretty slight compared to all the useful information. There, one of the things I came up with a phrase, a word really in my doctoral dissertation. This goes back to the mid late 1970s. Anthropotropic, which I say media are anthropotropic. They tend to evolve towards, that's where tropic comes in, human function. So, the telegraph gives way to the telephone. And of course, that's pretty much where it stopped in the 1970s. But now we have FaceTime and Zoom and so forth. So you now have the visual dimension, etc. Anyway, 5 years ago, I or anyone searched on anthropotropic, they probably wouldn't have gotten anything. Now, if you search on it, the AI quotes some kind of article, actually a very good article that was just published a couple of months ago in a Chinese journal. And that kind of thing, as long as you,
Yeah.
yeah, I find that's very, very useful. By the way, I do have to say, go ahead.
That does even relate to the amputations and extensions. I mean, that you could put those three together. If you're looking at it from the lens of the AI, which you were, they're becoming more human. The other way, we're becoming more cyborg. So yeah, the two we're meeting in the middle, so to speak.
Yes, that's a very, very good point. It's having effects to both parties of the conversation or both parties of the relationship, AI and human. I would feel bad if I didn't mention, you mentioned Joichi Ito. He actually was one of the very first, literally two students that were taking courses in an organization called Connected Education that my wife, Tina, and I founded in the early 1980s. And he was obviously much younger than, but it's not that he became so important because of the courses that he took, but we recognized back then this was a brilliant kid, pretty much. He was like maybe in his early 20s back then, 19 and 20. Yeah.
You planted residual ideas, because when you read that manifesto, that's a kind of media ecological. It's shot through with notions of that we need to come up with a healthy relationship with media. He quotes Anscombe, the 1950s ethicist, to say that we need flourishing, right? What do we want to come up with? A good life, flourishing, survival. But this is not science talk, as Sherry Turkle would tell us, right? This isn't how scientists think or talk. I find him, I realize there was supposed to have been a bit of a Me Too stink went up for around his intellectual life, but what he contributed with that manifesto and even some of the after studies of it, I think it's really important work. I really like his voice.
Yeah, and look, it is a very serious and perplexing issue. What do you do? And obviously, it not only affects scholars, it affects famous musicians, uh, actors, and a whole range of people. On the one hand, you have the work that anyone does. On the other hand, you have their personal life, and if a person is problematic, let's put it that way, in their personal life, what are you supposed to do about their work, which may have nothing to do with their personal life?
Well, I'm going to be loath to give my personal point of view, except to say that having been raised at a time when personal freedom meant more than um, collective collective agreements, I don't find it all that hard to dismiss the work from the life, but I know that's not really a popular point of view. I mean, here we've had the heartbreak. I don't know if you knew Alice Munro's work.
Well, I know her name, but I
Yeah,
don't know.
there's like really difficult revelations about the person's personal life, but yeah, I really have a difficult time thinking that because they're errant humans and maybe even evil in some, it doesn't mean, I mean, if you have a view, that's not the whole picture, right? That's a part of some, yeah. So I know it's not a popular view, so I have to be quiet, probably get fired from my university for holding that uh illiberal liberal view. Yeah, I have I don't I hate that cancel culture. I find really repellent because that's one of the mob things about social media, right?
Yes, well, I agree with you 100%, and you and I have a lot in common because I often find myself, before I say something, I'll probably get fired, for saying this. That comes up even in my classes. I say, well, don't tell anyone that I said this in this class, or whatever the point of view is. And yes, I think, I mean, cancel culture is outrageous for a variety of reasons. One of them is if you believe innocent until proven guilty,
Mhm.
people are in effect canceled just on hearsay. But but there is a deeper issue, which actually we're talking about now, and I'm glad we are, the issue of the person's work versus, what the person is as a human being. And
It's not really guilty because this is ethical values as held by a group of people who now identify as having like values, a particular, in some cases, let's say a liberal group, and you've broken a code. You haven't really broken a law, and it's got all the things like bullyism, yeah, I really have a lot of problems with it, that the group will feel empowered to pull someone down who has actually accomplished something and worked hard and made mistakes. Yeah, it's heartbreaking, I think. I mean, you're right. Neil Gaiman is the other one that really does bother me. He writes about dark sides, and then to have it, and anyway, he would have an expectation that his life would be, a rose garden of pure light. Obviously, he has interests that are not, it's sort of an odd human expectation that you get only one side of people. I think now I'm really in trouble.
no, no, listen, and this happens all the time. Isaac Asimov, I have no idea whether this was true or not. I met him, I think maybe 2 or 3 times in person. It was said that at science fiction conventions, he would occasionally grab a woman in an unwelcome way. And I think the Foundation trilogy is, well, at least it's my favorite, science fiction trilogy, and I've read a whole bunch of them. And
We
it's
can
such a,
even, but we can bring this back to McLuhan because there's been a lot of apologizing for him too. I guess that wasn't his particular, um, he wasn't that way inclined. But so many have said, I think this are the biography of him by um, Doug, Doug Copeland,
Mhm.
and he wrote as an out gay intellectual and artist, and brilliant. You remember the Generation X was his really famous flash of a book, and then he wrote a biography about McLuhan. And I thought it was kind of touching because as an artist, he actually extended a generous hand. He said, "I tell my friends I'm writing about McLuhan." They go, "Oh, why would you be writing about that patriarchal, white, homophobic, dead man?" And he has, I mean, it doesn't do it all, but he says he's watching a movie the other night. And it had Betty Davis, and I forget the other, maybe the guy who played Rhett Butler, and they were drinking.
Clark Gable.
Yeah, and they were drinking. It's just a footnote in his book too. They were in the movie. They were drinking so much they got tipsy. So they said, "Well, we better go out and get some fresh air. Let's go for a drive." And they went for a drive, and they were smoking in the car, and they get pulled over by a cop. And he says, what astonished me more was that they were sitting smoking cigarettes and blowing it up, because social mores change so quickly, is what he's trying to get at. But, and it was just wonderful. He's a great writer. He ended it with all that to say that, some 40 years ago, smoking, drinking and driving, smoking, these were these were seen as kind of naughty things to do, not illegal. And we have, the changes, we can't just judge too from where we sit right now that maybe things were different. The culture was different. What was considered except well, yeah, we would both know that to be the case, that things have changed.
100%. I agree with you completely. I did want to say a quick point about parasocial relationships. They, of course, didn't begin in our age or even slightly before us. One of the things I was really interested in finding out years ago is Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, would every Sunday, he lived in Manhattan, put on his white suit, white jacket, white slacks, and walk down Fifth Avenue, and there would be crowds of adoring fans who had read his book, who would say hello to him, and it was a little different. Obviously, it was in person. It wasn't, so they were able to see him physically, but they didn't know him personally from Adam, and yet they loved him because they had read his books and felt that they somehow knew him, and they wanted to show themselves to him and let um, uh, Clemens know that he was loved by them. So there is this tendency, I think, that people have, if you have any kind of relationship, intellectual, personal, whatever, uh, and it's through some kind of medium, whether it's a book or music or a film or a television series. The feelings you have towards that media presentation inevitably spill into the feelings you have for the human being who's delivering that presentation to you.
Mhm.
So I find that interesting. Why don't you tell us about what you're working on? Go ahead. Do you want to comment on that?
Remember that. Sorry, that is interesting because I forget about that. That it's not just holding hands and bullying. It's also people feel personally and morally outraged when a figure they put on a pedestal falls because it's not their value. So yeah, that's true too.
Yeah. Well, just on that point, I don't know if you have heard of a folk singer by the name of Phil Ochs. Back in the 1960s, many people, including my wife and I, uh, she was then just my girlfriend, we're not that old, we basically thought that Phil Ochs was right up there with Bob Dylan, and we weren't the only ones. I mean, that's how important he was for a brief period of time. Tragically, he took his own life, Phil Ochs did, in the mid 1970s. But one of the brilliant songs, and I highly recommend it, that he wrote is something called The Crucifixion. And it was written after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The gist of the song is a really disturbing, but in many ways, if you think about it, a valid point. It's that fans build people up, they put them on a pedestal, but that's not the end of the process. When they put someone up on a pedestal, they may not be aware of this, but they're unconsciously waiting for the person to fall from the pedestal. And they even derive some pleasure from that. Now, if you think about it, that's hard to believe. I mean, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, where was there any pleasure? But Phil Oakes's point is, why did we have to know exactly what happened? The moment the bullets hit his head, and
Yeah, no, but it does carry through, Paul, because you think about it's still supermarket tablets trying to talk about his peccadillos. So pleasure's still trying to sift through that. But I was thinking, where there's life, there's hope. If this is the case, a lot of people have put Trump up on a pedestal, and we don't have to wait very long. It seems to be rocking back and forth at this point, I hope. Yeah.
oh, that's a great thought. I love that. I'd love to see Phil Oakes proven right again. You know, uh,
Recast.
yeah. Well, yeah. I'm sure a lot of people are feeling that way. I just wish they'd be more vocal about it. I mean, you live in Canada, so you have the advantage of just, as McLuhan said, you're on the other side of the dew line. You can just look down and see what's going on here. When you live in the United States, and this is even true living, pretty much, we live like, a couple of miles north of New York City. It's about as blue and democratic as you could ask for. But we, more than once, walking around the neighborhood, driving around, a couple of blocks, we see like a big Trump sign, outside someone's house. So, you
Yeah, I
know,
remember
the,
being on a holiday just a while ago and seeing normal looking people lined up to go inside the Trump Hotel. You think like you wouldn't, but you
the,
would. But the luxury this is how I see the luxury we have as Canadians, really. If I was in the States and you all feel somewhat compelled to do something, say something, it's your backyard. But whereas we have the luxury of watching and kind of horror and, like how did they do that? But yeah, it's a terrible situation to be in, to know you have to do something but no, there's not much you can do right now. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have a great luxury up there in Canada. You can look at what's going on in the United States, and it's just another horror movie, you know.
Yeah, surprise horror where you lose your best friends in some ways, right? They didn't make it through the they didn't make it through the woods. But it's not quite that easy because of course the decisions Trump makes, and that's one of the horrors to have anyway, such a person making ripples in the economies of every country so that there's, real suffering here as a result. But, it's not nothing compared to what happens when ICE pulls himself together and just decide to appear and grab people. It's shocking.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's infecting all levels of society. It's, there's a cable station, and it's now, I guess, streaming. It's called Yes, YES, and it broadcasts New York Yankee games. It broadcasts football games, basketball games, and it was recently, I don't know, bought out or picked up by a system called Gotham. Anyway, so we're watching a Yankee game the other night, and on comes a commercial for ICE,
Mhm.
basically recruiting people. And I mean, just we're enjoying the game, and we have to see this, on television.
Mhm.
And but that this is what happens, and that does have the characteristics of a horror movie because the horror begins in one place and then gradually spreads all over.
That's the thing, isn't it? Do it once and we're shocked, but yeah, it just the ball starts rolling. Yeah, we get to be the new norm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, why don't we wrap this up by your telling me and therefore our viewers and listeners what's your next project going to be? You must have like another book in mind that you wanted to write for years. Maybe you started writing it already. Tell
I
us.
just it'll be a book, but it's a new hobby horse, and it's actually two-pronged. On the one hand, I was interested in a really slim book called City as Classroom, which probably, truth be told, is more Eric's than Marshall McLuhan's. But I feel lucky because I was able to meet and talk to Eric about it, and Kathy Kawasaki, Hutchin Kawasaki, was generous enough to talk to me about it too. And I think it's a super project, not just to, I use it in a class I have called Composing Winnipeg, and I excerpt a few things, and the students they see so much. Like I ask them to think about what they see and don't see. There's exercises for perception. So just a few moves to make it modern, to make it apply. That's one thing I'd like to do. Because I think it could, that's the ever hopeful part where maybe it would make a difference with students. It's short and quick, but maybe making them just that insight that you seeing by rote and by habit, only seeing and not sensing that there's a whole world out there that you're not really onto yet. And I think that would be so liberating for them to see that, and it's powerful, and then they might feel they could do more. So that's one. The other half, and I like maybe if I can see how I bring them together, it makes more sense. Um, I think I haven't decided whether it's for good or bad. Uh, you may not remember, but I gave a short talk on this at an IGS symposium in spring, and it's been dogging me since. It had to do with the issue of hope, optimism, and hope, but whether or not that's married to an idea of progress, human progress. And of all things, so then I started to contrast Postman to McLuhan more carefully on this matter. And really interesting things started to fall out where you actually have Postman disavowing, saying young me was charmed by the words and the ideas and the kind of hoping for the next century, and the bravado, if not so much about this. He some really interesting comments because his bridge to the 18th century. He thinks we can bring actual values forward of worth. And what I really liked about Postman is the line where he says, yeah, let's not get mixed up. There's no question we've made progress. We have better things. We have medicine, we have safety lights regulate driving. Some 20 years ago he was talking. At any rate, he's able to talk about the stuff of technology and say nobody would deny that we live longer, safer. On the other hand, you know him better than I do. Some of the things he says about the 20th century, unflinching when he says, we're the ones who got the bombs. We came up with the Holocaust. We've come up with some of the most wretched evil over this century. So I don't think we've progressed, but we could. I really like his, but we could. And then he goes back and talks about sort of everlasting, ever living values we could pull forward. And I also really was impressed with Postman because he does some tricky footwork, and he's known for saying those kind of critical things about postmodernists, that they go too far and develop a form of mental illness, which is kind of funny. But his whole, he completely acquiesces to the idea of relativity, that we only know certain things, we don't know everything, so more of an anthropological view. What we choose to call knowledge is chosen, and he will put that forward. Anyway, this is stuff, that's what all this to say, I'm finding those two views and how they oppose very different. McLuhan, on the other hand, does not believe in progress, not one whit. He only talks about change, difference, reconfiguration. He says it could be for good or bad, but I don't think he's particularly hopeful that we have patterns. But you're going to obsolesce, you're going to lose something, gain something, retreat. So it's very much just about a change partner sort of thing. That when we had orality, unlike Postman, who said, like, this is pretty interesting. Postman said it was like paradise from McLuhan, paradise found, paradise lost. Now new orality, paradise came. I don't see that at all. Like, I think Postman's actually wrong in planting that Christian mythology on McLuhan's reading, because paradise that was screwed up, paradise lost that had great beauty. Like, he never gave it singular. And I don't think he ever had any hope that we're going to a great good life on this earth. We're just picking our way. And the nice thing is the repetitions and the patterns. Yeah. So that's what I really like. I'm interested in the idea of, and again, I'm interested in it because it doesn't really matter what they thought some 20, 30 years ago, but current scholars are really riled up about, really angry about people who dare to believe in progress, because they're saying, look at what you've given us. We wear the legacy of a dead earth and warfare and capitalism that's rampant. So we've got that. Anyway, all that litany of all the things that are wrong and not fixed, and maybe not fixable. But trying to think through. I mean, I first went in there to save McLuhan and say, well, but wait a minute, he never did say we were progressing. He's okay. But then I sort of started falling for the sane and common sense idea of Postman, to try to say, just because everything isn't perfect, it doesn't mean we didn't have a good idea 200 years ago, and we should try to use our brains and pick those up and bring those forward. So yeah, some way of putting this picture together that makes sense, rather than simply saying anyone who thinks there's progress is crazy. We're about, as a species, to implode. Right? Yeah.
Well, I agree completely with what's lacking in that final point that you made. I have a couple of quick things to say about Postman in case you and our listeners and viewers are interested. Postman was my doctoral dissertation advisor. He was the best teacher that I ever had in my life. And I say that as someone who disagreed with a lot of his views, but a brilliant teacher. But two interesting points, I think, in terms of what you're talking about. I want to ask Postman, look, in the 1960s, you wrote or co-wrote with Charlie Weingartner a book called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. And that was basically Postman as the radical, progressive, way. And in that book, how you can use media to counteract wrong things in society. Uh, but a couple of decades later, he writes teaching as a conserving activity. So at some point, I said to him, well, what's going on here? Two very different books. Because in teaching as a conserving activity, what he describes as the responsibility of the teacher is to warn people about the dangers of media. And uh, Postman's answer to me, it may sound shocking, but what he said to me was, I assume, Paul, that you have more than one suit, one vest, one shirt. You put on different clothes at different times, right? May depend on how the weather is, but by and large, even if the weather stayed the same, you don't wear the same clothing every day. Well, you know, teaching as a conserving activity is just another piece of clothing that I decided to put on. I thought that really said a lot. In other words, for
That's really
Postman,
with money, right? Putting things on. Yeah.
yes, and
Yeah.
it's the joy from a psychological sense. It's the joy of exploring a perspective. It doesn't matter really whether you agree or disagree with it. It's just fun to enjoy a perspective. The other thing about Postman is he never warmed up to personal computers in any manner, shape, or form. Back in the mid 1990s, a long time ago, over 20 years ago, I was at a conference. Postman and Christine Nystrom was there, and I was talking about, I don't know, I guess, the importance of laptops makes it easier for people. This was like, the beginning of the web becoming a public medium. And Postman said, as far as I'm concerned, the personal computer is just another kind of screen, i.e., another television experience. And I tried to reason with him, saying, well, on a computer, I can write and send my thoughts out to someone. And, even more so, of course, social media hadn't quite begun. Maybe there were a couple of blogs out there. I can actually get my ideas out there. Most people, and even I could rarely do that on television. You had to get on some kind of show. And I tried to reason with Postman that this was an advance in human communication, and he just totally refused to consider that. So, in terms of your interest in hope, and I think you should, write that book. It's a very important topic. For Postman, at least publicly, there was no hope for certain things. There's hope for us, but certain things were irredeemably dangerous and bad for us to use. In other words, getting back to guns, knives, and pillows, he
Yeah.
rejected my view that media and technology are essentially knives. He thought some were bad, they were guns, and some were pillows, they were good.
Yeah, that gets into the crazy, stupid, yeah, evaluating, right? Yeah, that he's not afraid to try to evaluate and, yeah, rank. That's interesting, because I actually, I thought what you were getting at was even with the conservative teaching and teaching for a progressive style, that he was, there's sort of two hands of this, if you do one, you do the, like, when you're doing one, you have the other in mind anyway, so you're just stepping foot with one, stepping forward and backward. But you're sure. So he thought some technologies were just not to be had.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, when I would criticize Jacques Ellul for condemning all technology in the form of writing books that condemned all technology, he Postman didn't see any problem with that because he said, well, a book is an inherently good technology, and it's okay to use a good technology to basically attack all technologies because there was value and goodness in that technology. And on the other hand, television for the later Postman or the latter Postman, that was just inherently bad. As you probably know, the argument that was often brought up to Postman by me and his other students and other people when he criticized television, and I would say, well, what about Sesame Street? And isn't that good? Isn't And his answer is no, it's not, because, for example, and he did have some good examples. It teaches the kids who watch Sesame Street, you can shut off the conversation whenever you want. You can walk out of the room during the conversation. You can fall asleep, during that presentation. And then they go to school having been schooled, in quotes, in that bad series of habits. So,
I
yeah,
mean, we get even further. You kind of agree, because then you get the propaganda idea also. Like maybe they were, maybe we trust them as wise uh, content creators, but they're telling kids this is good and this is bad and this is funny and this is not. I mean, there's all of that, and you might not see it so much in something that looks benign like Sesame Street, but gaming. If you observe kids now with games, like what it means to win and lose and what rules are. Yeah, my students were pointing this out to me, how that their whole notion of what's fair and winning and losing is really controlled now by the people making games. And it's really, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, games and knives, again, they definitely do inculcate bad things, but they can do good things, I think, as well. All right. Listen, it was great talking to you. And again, for those of you who are watching this on video, it will, pretty much within a week be also up on the audio podcast Light On, Light Through, which those of you who are familiar with McLuhan will know how and why I came up with that name for the podcast. And Jaqueline, I'll be sure to have you back here to talk about both of those books that you have just told us
Oh, I hope so. It was lots of fun and lots to talk about and learn. Yeah, that was great.
absolutely. Take care then.
Have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.